The rejected Omega spent her last coins to save a dying wolf, never knowing he was the Alpha King. Ilara did not cry when he said the words. She had learned a long time ago that crying in front of people who already thought little of you only gave them more to talk about later. So she stood straight, her hands loose at her sides, and she let the words hit her the way cold rain hits, all at once, no warning, no mercy. I reject you. 2 words. That was all it took to unravel every quiet hope she had carried into that hall. Nathaniel Cross said them loudly, clearly, the way a man says something he wants everyone to hear. And everyone did hear. The great hall of Ashvale fell into a silence that was somehow louder than noise, a silence filled with the held breath of 200 wolves who had all turned to look at her. Ilara Voss. 21 years old. Omega. The girl from the edge of the settlement whose father had disappeared 7 years ago and whose mother had spent the years since slowly becoming someone who was barely there at all. Ilara, who cooked and cleaned and mended and worked, who had saved carefully and quietly and told no one what she was saving for. Ilara, who had worn the only dress that still fit her properly and done her hair the best she could with the small cracked mirror in her room. Nathaniel was looking at her the way people look at something that has fallen in the road, with mild irritation, like it was in his way. He was handsome in the way that some men are handsome and know it too well. Behind him stood half a dozen of his friends, most of them smirking, one of them covering her mouth like she was trying not to laugh. Ilara did not look at them. She looked at Nathaniel, and then she looked away, and then she walked out of the hall. Not fast. She did not run. She walked the same way she always walked, steadily, with her head up, as if she were going somewhere she had decided to go, rather than escaping a place that had just embarrassed her in front of everyone she had ever known. Outside, the night air was cold and full of pine. She walked down the long path that led away from the pack's central buildings, past the meeting house and the children's yard and the elder women's corner, and she kept walking until she reached the far end of the settlement where the houses grew smaller and the lights grew fewer. Her house was the last one before the tree line. It had always been the last one. She had grown up knowing she lived at the edge of things, at the place where the settlement stopped caring. Inside, her mother was asleep in the chair again. Ilara covered her with the worn blanket from the back of the sofa, then went to her own room and sat on the mattress in the dark. There was a clay jar on the small shelf beside her bed. It was plain and chipped at the lip, and she had owned it since she was 12, when she had found it thrown out behind the apothecary and taken it home because it was still good, still useful, just unwanted. She lifted it now and held it in both hands. Inside it, coins shifted against each other with a soft clinking sound. Every coin in that jar she had earned herself. Some she had made by doing washing for families in the settlement. Some she had made by selling small packets of dried herbs she gathered from the graywood at the edge of packed territory. A few she had made by mending clothes and fixing boots and doing the quiet, unnoticed work that people always needed done and never wanted to do themselves. She had been saving for nearly 3 years. She had been saving for a way out. She was not angry, she decided. Or she was, but the anger was the quiet kind, the kind that sits low and steady and does not burn things down, it just burns. What she felt more than anger was a kind of settled certainty. She had known, somewhere in the honest part of herself, that tonight would go badly. She had not let herself think it clearly because thinking it clearly would have meant giving up before she started. But she had known. Ashvale had never wanted her. She had spent 21 years trying to be useful enough, quiet enough, small enough that they might decide to keep her. It had not worked. It was not going to work. The bonding ceremony tonight had just made official what had always been true. She set the jar back on the shelf. She had enough to leave. She had counted it twice that week. If she left within the next few days, she could get south to the open territories where no one knew her name, where Omega women could work independently, where the pack structure was looser and kinder and less interested in keeping people in their place. She had a plan. She had always had a plan. She let herself cry for a while then, because she was alone and no one could see, and because it was a real loss even if it was also a relief. She cried for the girl who had gotten dressed carefully and done her hair and told herself maybe, just maybe, tonight would be the night something good happened. She cried quietly, with her face in her pillow, the way she had cried about many things over the years without anyone ever knowing. Then she stopped. She wiped her face. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and made a list in her head of everything she needed to do before she left. She had 3 days. She did not know, lying there in the dark, that 3 days would be more than enough time for everything she thought she understood about her life to change completely. The next morning she rose before the sun, the way she always did. She put water on to heat and she made 2 cups of tea, one for herself and one for her mother, and she sat at the small kitchen table and drank hers while looking at the list she had written on the back of an old receipt. She had 9 things on the list. She would start with the ones that needed to be done outside the settlement, while the weather was still dry. She told herself it was an ordinary morning. She nearly believed it. Her mother came into the kitchen just as Alara was putting on her boots. Vera Voss was 44 years old and looked older, a woman who had once been warm and quick and full of laughter, or so the old neighbors said. Alara herself barely remembered that version of her mother. What she knew was the quiet version, the distant version, the version that moved through each day like someone walking in deep water. "You came home early last night," Vera said. "The ceremony ended early," Alara said, which was not quite a lie. Vera looked at her for a moment with an expression Alara could not fully read, and then she looked at the tea and said, "Thank you for this." "There is bread in the cloth by the window," Alara said. "I'll be back before dark." She took her basket and her small knife for cutting and she went out into the morning. She went to the grey wood. The grey wood was not officially packed territory. It was the stretch of old forest that ran along the eastern boundary of Ashvile's land, thick with pine and oak and old silver birch, crossed by 2 shallow streams and full of the kind of quiet that only old forests have. The pack officially discouraged people from going too deep into it, because the grey wood extended beyond their boundary markers and into neutral land where other wolves sometimes passed through. But the grey wood's edges were full of useful things, plants and bark and moss that Alara had been gathering and using and selling for years. She had been in the grey wood hundreds of times. She knew which paths were safe and which went too deep. She knew where the good mushrooms grew in autumn and where the elderflower bloomed in spring. She knew the sounds the birds made when something larger was moving through and she knew to pay attention to those sounds. She was paying attention that morning. Which was the only reason she saw him. She almost did not. The deadfall was large, a great pine that had come down in last winter's storms and dragged 2 other trees with it in its fall, leaving a tangle of branches and root and decaying wood that was already half covered in moss and creeping plants. From 5 steps away it just looked like fallen timber. From 2 steps away she saw the grey between the branches and stopped. She stood very still. Her heart was going fast and she was not sure why, not yet, because her mind had not caught up to what her eyes were seeing. Then she understood. It was a wolf. Not a small one. It was the largest wolf she had ever seen, heavy and long, with a coat that was silver grey with dark markings along the shoulders and sides. It was lying on its side, partially pinned by one of the fallen branches, and it was not moving the way a healthy animal is still. It was barely moving the way an animal that is still alive moves. She could see its side rising and falling in shallow, 2 fast breaths. Alara's first thought was very practical. This animal is not from our pack. She could tell by the scent. She had grown up around Ashvile's wolves and she knew their scent the same way she knew the smell of her own kitchen. This wolf had a different scent, deep and layered and carrying something she did not have a word for, something that felt less like a smell and more like a pressure, a weight in the air around him. Her second thought was equally practical. This animal is dying. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the way one of his back legs was caught under the branch. She looked at the darkened fur that told her there was a wound underneath. She looked at his breathing. Then she knelt down and began to work. She was careful. She used a branch as a lever first, getting the weight of the fallen pine off his leg by degrees, stopping each time he made a sound, watching his reactions. It took a long time. Her arms ached. At one point the branch shifted wrong and she scraped her palm badly on the bark, and she pressed her hand against her coat for a moment and then kept going. When she finally got his leg free, she could see the wound properly. It was bad. Something had torn into the muscle above the joint. She thought it might have happened before he got pinned, that he might have been hurt and then fallen here and been trapped. The wound was not fresh. It was deep and the edges were swollen, and she could see the early signs of infection already beginning, the heat and the discoloration and the way the flesh around it was pulling tight. She worked for a long time. She used what she had in her basket, clean cloth for binding, a paste she made from the herbs she had already gathered, water from the nearby stream. She cleaned the wound as well as she could and wrapped it firmly, and then she sat back on her heels and thought about what she did not have. She knew what she needed. There was a compound that the apothecary kept, a preparation made from specific roots and resins that was expensive because it took a long time to make properly. It was the kind of thing that stopped an infection from deepening further. Without it, what she had done was just delaying the inevitable. With it, he had a real chance. She thought about her jar. She thought about the coins she had counted twice and the plan she had made and the 3 days she had given herself. She looked at the wolf, who had not woken up, who was breathing in those shallow too-fast breaths, who had been lying here alone in the cold grey wood with no one knowing and no one coming. She picked up her basket and walked back toward the settlement. The apothecary was an old man named Gerald who smelled of pine resin and kept his shop in a low building near the elder women's corner. He was not unkind, but he was careful with money in the way that people who have watched others be careless with it tend to be. Ilara told him what she needed. He named a price. She did not argue. She went home and counted the coins out of the jar, took them back to Gerald, and watched him wrap the preparation in brown paper. She went back to the grey wood. She stayed with the wolf for 2 days. She built a rough shelter from fallen branches and pine boughs, the same kind of thing she had made as a child when she and the other pack children played in the woods before the other children had decided she was not worth playing with. She applied the preparation twice a day. She brought water from the stream. She kept a small fire at the shelter's entrance, not touching it for warmth because she did not want to frighten him with open flame, but at enough distance that the smoke kept insects away. He drifted in and out of awareness. She could tell when he was closer to the surface because his breathing changed, became deeper and more deliberate, and his eyes would open partway. They were a color she had no word for, not gold and not brown, something between the two, the color of pine resin held up to autumn light. Once, on the second evening, he looked at her properly. She was not sure how much of her he was actually seeing. She had been quiet for a long time and she had run out of practical things to do for a few minutes, and so she had simply been sitting beside him, her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the sounds the forest made settling into night. "I do not know who you are," she said, because she felt strange not saying anything, and he was awake enough to perhaps hear. "You are clearly not one of ours. You are also very large, so I am choosing not to think about that too much." She paused. "You are going to be all right. The infection is already doing less than it was. You just need to rest." He looked at her for a long moment. She had the odd feeling, not comfortable exactly but not unpleasant either, of being seen very clearly by something that had no particular reason to see her well. Then he closed his eyes, and his breathing settled into something slower and steadier, and she sat beside him until she was sure he was properly sleeping before she allowed herself to do the same. She woke on the 3rd morning and he was gone. Not slowly, not messily, simply gone. The grass where he had lain was still pressed flat and warm. The wrappings she had changed the previous evening were neatly to one side. There were tracks in the soft earth at the shelter's edge, deep clear tracks, and then they ended where the ground hardened and she lost them. She stood in the empty shelter for a long moment. The morning was very still. Somewhere in the upper branches a bird was starting its first call of the day. She picked up her things and went home. Her jar was empty. She sat on her bed and held it and thought that she would need to start again, that she would need more time now before she could leave. She added up the weeks in her head and felt the heaviness of it, the extra months of Ashvale, the extra months of being the girl at the edge of everything. She set the jar on the shelf. She went to make tea. She was not thinking about the wolf anymore. She was thinking about what she needed to do next, about practical things, about lists. She did not know yet that she was thinking about the wrong things entirely. She did not know yet that in 6 days, the world was going to arrive at Ashvale's gate and ask for her by name. 6 days was long enough to almost forget. Almost, but not entirely, because the memory of those 2 days in the Greywood had a quality to it that other memories did not, a solidness, a warmth. The way the light had come through the pine branches in the late afternoon and the sound of the stream and the strange, steady feeling of sitting beside something large and living that trusted her enough to sleep. She did not think about it constantly. She was too busy for that. But it came back to her at odd moments, in the quiet between tasks, the way certain things do when they have mattered more than you have let yourself admit. She had restarted her saving. Gerald had given her a few small jobs, labeling preparations, sorting dried herbs into packets, the kind of careful detailed work that needed patient hands, and she had taken them without being asked twice. She had also taken on extra washing for 2 of the families in the northern quarter, which meant early mornings and cold water and aching wrists by midday, but it was money and she kept her eyes on what the money meant. Nathaniel Cross had not spoken to her again after the bonding ceremony. She passed him twice in the week that followed, once near the grain store and once on the main path, and both times he looked through her the way people look through someone they have decided does not exist. She was fine with this. The alternative was worse. What she could not avoid was the talk. Ashvale was not a large settlement and a public rejection at the bonding ceremony was the kind of thing that moved through a community the way water moves through dry ground, fast and into every crack. She heard fragments of it, in the tone people used when they said good morning to her, in the way conversations paused when she entered the washing room, in the careful way the women of Nathaniel's family looked past her when she passed. She had spent enough of her life being talked about quietly to recognize the shape of it, even when she could not hear the words. She ignored it. She had practice. On the morning of the 6th day after the Greywood, she was hanging washing on the line behind her house when she first heard the noise. It was not the usual noise of the settlement starting its day, it was different in quality, more movement, more voices, and underneath it a particular kind of tension that made the back of her neck prick. She finished hanging the shirt she was holding. She dried her hands on her apron. She went to find out what was happening. People were moving toward the settlement's central ground. Not running, but walking fast with that particular forward lean that meant something important was pulling them. She stopped a girl she recognized, one of the weaver's daughters, and asked. "The Alpha King's retinue," the girl said, eyes wide. "They sent word this morning. They will be here before noon." Ilara let her go. She stood in the lane for a moment, processing this the same way she processed all large pieces of news, by setting aside her first reaction and looking at the fact itself. The Alpha King's retinue. Not a regional lord, not a neighboring pack leader. The Alpha King. Caden Ashford, who ruled 7 territories and had not, as far as anyone in Ashvale knew, visited a settlement of this size in living memory. She went back to her washing. There were still 6 shirts and a set of bed linens waiting. The Alpha King's arrival was nothing to do with her. She had work to finish. By the time the retinue arrived, she had finished the washing and started on the bread she owed to one of the northern families by evening. She heard the sound of it from inside her kitchen, the particular cadence of many feet moving in formation, horses, the low calls of people organizing. She did not go to watch. Half the settlement seemed to have gone to watch. She kept her hands in the dough and listened to the distance of it and thought about her list. It was her mother who came to the door first. Vera Voss had not left the house voluntarily in 2 weeks. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat half on and an expression Alara had not seen on her face in a long time, something awake, something present, something that looked almost like the woman who existed in old neighbors' stories. "Ilara," she said. "They are asking for you." Ilara looked up from the dough. "What?" At the central ground. One of the king's men came to the door. He asked by name. "Ilara Voss, the Omega who lives at the edge, the one who knows the grey wood." Vera paused. "That is you." Ilara looked at her hands. She looked at the dough. She looked at her mother's face, which was waiting in a way it had not waited for anything in years. She went to the basin and washed her hands. She dried them. She untied her apron and set it over the back of the chair. She put on her coat, the better one, the dark green one that she kept for outside the house, though she did not examine why she chose the better one. It was just a choice her hands made on their own. "Will you come?" she asked her mother. Vera looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said, which surprised them both. They walked to the central ground together, Alara and her mother, through the lanes that were quieter than usual because most of the settlement was already gathered ahead of them. As they came around the last bend and the central ground opened up before them, Alara stopped and took it in. She had never seen anything quite like it. The king's retinue was large and organized with a precision that Ashvile's pack structure, informal and small as it was, could not match. There were wolves in uniform she did not recognize, men and women both, stationed at intervals around the ground's edge. There were several officials in darker clothing, people with the look of those who manage important things and take no great pleasure in it. And there were horses at the far end, large and well kept, still being walked by handlers. The pack of Ashvale stood facing all of this with the particular stillness of people who are trying hard to look calm. Ilara spotted the Ashvale Alpha, Gregor Holt, standing at the front of the crowd with his shoulders pulled back and his jaw set, a man working very hard to seem like he had expected all of this. And then Ilara saw the man in the center of it and she stopped breathing. Not because of what he was, though she knew what he was the moment she saw him, because it was not possible to look at Caden Ashford and not understand immediately and completely that you were looking at someone who held more authority than you had ever been in the presence of before. There was no arrogance in it. Arrogance she would have recognized and dismissed. This was different. This was simply a man who was exactly what he was, fully and without apology, the way a mountain is a mountain without needing to announce itself. She stopped breathing because she knew his face. Not from a portrait. Not from descriptions in the settlement's records. She knew it the way you know a thing you have seen in low light, from close, when the light was honest and there was no reason for pretense. She knew the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders and the way his eyes moved when they were searching for something specific. She had sat beside him in a shelter in the Greywood and told him he was going to be all right. She had wrapped the wound above his knee with her own hands. She had spent her last coins on his survival. The thought arrived in her mind with a kind of terrible clarity, one piece at a time and then all at once, the wolf. The silver-gray wolf. The size of him. The weight of his presence even collapsed and barely conscious. The scent she had not been able to name, the thing that felt less like a smell and more like a pressure, a significance, something that her instincts had recognized before her mind did. A shifter. Of course he was a shifter. She had known he was a shifter. She had simply not let herself think beyond that, had not followed the question forward to ask what kind of shifter, what rank, what. His eyes found her. She knew the moment they did because the whole quality of the space between them changed, and because every member of his retinue shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a group of people shifts when the person they are all watching suddenly focuses on something specific. He did not move. He was very still in the way he had been still in the forest, completely, without effort, the stillness of something that does not need to move to be present. Gregor Holt was saying something. Ilara could hear his voice at the edge of her awareness, but she could not pull the words into meaning. The king was looking at her and she was looking at the king, and the world had gone a little distant around the edges. Then Caden Ashford said something to the man beside him, something quiet that she could not hear from across the ground. The man turned and looked at her and then looked back at the king and nodded. Ilara Voss, the official called. His voice carried clearly across the whole central ground. Come forward, please. The crowd between Ilara and the center of the ground parted. She was aware of it happening, aware of faces turning toward her, aware of Nathaniel Cross standing near the front with an expression she did not look at long enough to read. She was aware of her mother's hand brushing her arm briefly as she stepped forward, a small thing, barely a touch, but real. She walked forward. She walked the way she had always walked, even after the bonding ceremony, even after every quiet humiliation Ashvale had offered her over the years. She walked like she was going somewhere she had decided to go. She kept her chin level. She kept her hands still. She stopped a few feet from the Alpha King of the Seven Territories, and she looked at him directly because looking away had never done her any good. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the scar now, on the left side of his forearm, just below where his sleeve was rolled back. She had cleaned that wound. She knew its shape. When he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that does not need volume to carry weight. You, he said. Just that. One word. And something in the way he said it made it mean a dozen things at once: recognition, and something she could not name yet but which settled in her chest with a warmth she had not expected and did not know what to do with. She looked at him. She thought about the clay jar on her shelf, empty now, and about the dough she had left on the counter, and about the 6 months of saving that had gone toward keeping this man alive in a forest where no one else had come. She said nothing yet. She was thinking. She was always thinking. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, the thing she was thinking about was not a list, not a plan, not a way to manage what was coming. She was thinking that she had made a decision in the Greywood based on nothing more than the fact that a living thing had needed her and she had been there, and now that decision was standing in front of her wearing the face of the most powerful wolf in the known world. She thought, of all the things that could have happened after Nathaniel Cross said those 2 words in the Great Hall, this was not one she had imagined. The king was still watching her. Waiting, she realized. He was waiting for her. You look better than the last time I saw you, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that looked like relief. Caden Ashford had not expected to be grateful for anything in the 6 days since he had walked out of the Greywood on a leg that still pulled when he moved fast. Gratitude was not an emotion that came easily to him. He had been raised in a court that treated softness as a liability, by a father who believed that a king should need nothing and no one, and he had spent 15 years on the throne running that particular belief into the ground and finding out how wrong it was in the slowest and most painful way possible. But standing in the central ground of Ashvale, looking at a woman who had just told him he looked better than the last time she had seen him, the last time being when he was delirious with infection in a forest and she was telling him he was going to be all right, he felt it clearly. Gratitude. And something else, something that had been present since the moment he had seen her at the edge of the crowd, something his wolf had been insisting on with increasing urgency since the scouts had come back with information about a settlement to the north and a woman named Ilara Voss who gathered herbs and knew the Greywood. He turned to Aldrich, his chief advisor, and said, "We will need the private tent. And tea, if there is such a thing to be had here." Aldrich, who had served him for 11 years and had seen him through situations that would have broken more rigid men, simply nodded. Of course. The private tent was one of 3 they had set up in the hour before noon, when the advance riders had confirmed the settlement was ready to receive them. It was not elaborate. Caden had long ago stopped seeing the point of elaborate, just a space with walls and a table and chairs where conversations could happen without the whole world listening. Ilara sat across from him. She had taken the chair he indicated without hesitation, which he noticed. She had also looked around the tent with the particular expression of someone cataloging a space before deciding how to feel about it, which he also noticed. She held her hands in her lap, not clasped together the way nervous people held their hands, but simply resting, as if they were not anxious and had not been told they needed to be. Aldrich set tea on the table and left without being asked to, which was one of the many reasons Caden valued him. "I will tell you what happened," Caden said. "All of it. You deserve to know." She looked at him steadily. "All right." He told her the truth. Not the careful version he had told his counsel, not the diplomatic version that was already being shaped into an official account, the truth, plain and in order. He had been traveling light, he told her. For guards only, riding to meet a contact in the neutral territories, a matter that could not be handled through official channels and needed to be done quietly. He had known it was a risk. What he had not known was that the risk had been arranged. 2 of his 4 guards were not loyal to him. They had been loyal to a man named Oliver Crane, a senior figure in his own council who had spent 3 years laying the groundwork for what he intended as a careful and deniable removal. The ambush had happened at the Greywood's boundary. The 2 disloyal guards had acted in coordination with 3 wolves Crane had positioned in advance. Caden had handled himself. He had not survived 15 years on a contested throne by being unprepared for violence, but not cleanly. He had been badly hurt and he had fled into the Greywood because it was the only logical option, because neutral territory meant Crane's wolves could not follow without creating an incident that would expose the whole operation. He had run as far as he could in wolf form, which was further than most but not far enough. The fallen pine had been bad luck on top of everything else. He had drifted in and out of consciousness for what he estimated was the better part of a day before she found him. She had looked at him and then started working without any visible hesitation, which had cut through even the fog of fever and blood loss in a way very little had. He told her about the 2 days from his side, fragmented, incomplete, but honest about what he remembered. He told her about the sound of her voice in the evenings, which he had followed back toward awareness more than once when the alternative was something darker. He told her about leaving before she woke, which he had done not because he wanted to but because the situation required it. Oliver Crane's people were looking for a body, he said. I had perhaps a day before they sent someone to confirm. I needed to reach my loyal guard and I needed to do it before Crane knew he had failed. She had listened to all of this without interrupting. He was learning, a person who listened completely before she spoke, which was rarer than it should have been. What happened to Crane? She asked. He is in custody. The process of determining the full extent of what he organized is ongoing. It will take some time. She nodded slowly. And the 2 guards? Also in custody. Another pause. She picked up her tea and held it in both hands the way someone holds something warm when they are thinking. Outside the tent he could hear the movement of the settlement going on around them, the muffled sound of Aldrich managing the logistics of their presence with his usual quiet efficiency. I was not trying to help someone important, she said finally. I want you to understand that. I did not know. He was alive and he needed someone, and I was there. He looked at her. I know. I say that, she continued, not to make you feel that you owe me something, because I do not think that way about it. I say it because I need you to know the kind of person I am. I am not someone who does things for what they might bring back to me. I never have been. Caden set his own cup down. That is one of the reasons I came here, he said. Not the only one, but one of them. She looked at him with the directness that he was already recognizing as characteristic of her, as simply the way she engaged with the world. What are the other reasons? He considered, briefly, the various careful ways he might say what he was about to say. Then he decided that careful was not what this conversation needed. You are my fated mate, he said. I have known it since the moment I was conscious enough in that forest to know anything. My wolf recognized you before I could. She went very still. Not with shock exactly, she had the look of someone receiving information they had been aware might be coming and were now deciding how to process. She looked at the table. She looked at her tea. She looked at him. "That is a very large thing to say," she said. "Yes. I need to think about it." He had expected something different. He was not entirely sure what, not capitulation. He was not the kind of man who wanted capitulation, but perhaps something more immediate. More visible emotion. Not this careful, considered response from a woman who seemed to approach even extraordinary news the way she apparently approached everything else, by thinking it through before she decided what to feel. "How long?" he asked. She considered. "I do not know yet. I have spent most of my life in a place that decided what I was worth without asking me. I am not going to walk into the most important decision I will ever make without taking the time to ask myself." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about his father's voice, and about the countless meetings and negotiations and political calculations that had made up the last 15 years of his existence, and about how little any of it had ever felt like this, like something real happening in real time, without structure or precedent or a room full of advisors to tell him what the correct response was. "Take whatever time you need," he said. She looked at him with something that might have been surprise, quickly controlled. "Most men in your position would not say that. Most men in my position," he said, "have not been saved by someone who spent their last coins on a stranger in the forest." She looked at him for a long moment. He could not read her expression fully. It was the kind of face, he was realizing, that showed you what it chose to show you and kept the rest carefully behind its eyes. Then she stood. She was not tall, but she stood with the quality of someone who has decided exactly how much space they are allowed to take up and has made peace with it. "I am going to go home now," she said. "I have bread proving on the counter that will need to be shaped in the next hour or it will be wasted." "Of course," he said. She moved toward the tent's entrance. Then she stopped, not turning fully, just pausing. "The wound," she said. "Above your knee. It is healing cleanly?" He had not expected the question. "Yes," he said. "Completely." "Good," she said. And then she left. He sat in the quiet tent for a moment after she was gone. Aldrich appeared in the entrance with the expression of a man who has witnessed something he is going to be thinking about for some time. "Well," Aldrich said. "Yes," said Caden. "That was not how I expected that to go." "No," said Caden. "It was better." Outside, the Alpha of Ashvale was waiting to speak with him about whatever he felt it important for the Alpha King to hear about a small settlement that had just discovered itself to be more significant than it had ever thought. Caden stood and went to attend to it, and as he did, he caught, at the far edge of the central ground, a flash of dark green coat moving steadily away through the crowd, unhurried, head level, going to do what needed to be done. He watched until she was gone. In the outer crowd, Nathan Cross was watching too, with an expression that had started the morning as mild curiosity and had moved through several stages since then to arrive at something he was clearly not accustomed to feeling and did not particularly know what to do with. Caden glanced at him once, without pausing, and then looked away. Some things resolved themselves. He went to meet the Alpha of Ashvale and said everything the situation required, and all the while the part of his mind that was most honestly his own was very quiet and very certain in the way it had not been in a long time. He could wait. He had spent 15 years learning to be patient with things that mattered. He could wait for this. The first conversation after the tent was not planned. It happened on the second morning of the retinue's stay in Ashvale, when Alara was coming back from the Greywood with a basket of late-season herbs and Caden was walking the settlement's outer path without his full guard, something that made Aldrich visibly unhappy but which Caden did occasionally as a reminder to himself that he was a person as well as a king. They nearly walked into each other at the turn in the path. She stopped. He stopped. They looked at each other for a moment in the early morning light, which was grey and clean and smelled of pine and coming rain. "You are walking alone," she said. "Yes." Your advisor does not like that. He does not, Caden agreed. Do you mind company? She considered the question with the same seriousness she seemed to give everything. No, she said. They walked together. She pointed out things as they went, not performing the knowledge, just noting it naturally, the way someone shares information they find genuinely interesting. She told him about the plants at the Greywood's edge, which ones grew only in certain conditions and what those conditions meant about the soil, which ones had medicinal uses that the settlement's apothecary had not fully explored yet, which ones she had learned about from a book she had borrowed twice from the pack's small library and eventually copied out by hand because returning it was too difficult. You copied the whole book, he said. Just the useful parts. About 40 pages. He walked beside her and listened, which was something he did not often get to do, simply listen to someone talk about the things they knew without any political dimension to any of it, without anyone trying to manage his impression of them. She was not trying to manage his impression of her. She was just talking about plants. Tell me about yourself, she said after a while, with the same directness she used for everything. Not the version that is in the official records. The real one. He was quiet for a moment. It was not a question he was often asked, and when he was asked it, it was usually by people who were hoping the answer would give them something useful. I became king at 23, he said. My father died of an infection that should not have been fatal, but he refused treatment for it until it was too late, on the principle that acknowledging illness was a form of weakness. I spent the first 3 years of my reign dealing with the consequences of decisions he had made in his last decade that no one had felt able to challenge. Oliver Crane was one of several people who had benefited considerably from those years and did not want things to change. And do things change? Under you? Slowly, he said. It is harder than it sounds to change the direction of something very large that has been moving a particular way for a long time. She nodded. I know something about that. He looked at her. Your pack. My life, she said simply. Not bitterly. Just accurately. He thought about what Aldrich had told him, what the scouts had told Aldrich, which was drawn from careful and respectful conversation with several people in Ashvale, not from gossip but from the kind of listening that good intelligence required. He knew something about who Alara Voss was in this settlement. He knew about the rejection at the bonding ceremony. He knew about the years before it, the edge of the settlement, the work that kept her and her mother going, the careful saving that she had spent on him. He did not say any of this, because she had not told him and therefore it was not his to speak first. May I ask you something, he said. You can ask. I decide whether to answer. Fair, he said. What were you saving for? The coins. She was quiet for a few steps. He thought she might not answer. Then she said, a way out. South, to the open territories. Somewhere that did not know my name. He was quiet too. And now, he said. She glanced at him sideways. Now I am walking in the Greywood with the Alpha King, which was not on any list I made. Do you make a lot of lists? Constantly, she said. He thought, for the first time in a long time, that he wanted to know what was on those lists. Not because it would tell him something useful, but because it would tell him something real about a person he was finding, with increasing clarity, that he wanted to know in full. The rain came in from the east while they were still in the Greywood's edge, light at first and then steadier, the kind of autumn rain that settles in and intends to stay. She pulled her coat closer. He had not brought one, which she noticed with the same direct practicality she noticed everything. Come to the house, she said. I will make tea and you can wait out the worst of it before going back. He looked at her. Your house? Yes. Unless the Alpha King has a policy about small houses with cracked windowsills. I do not, he said. Her house was exactly what he would have expected from her, small and carefully ordered, everything in its place, every object present because it was useful and not because it was decorative. A worn sofa with a good blanket over it. a kitchen with the smell of bread and dried herbs. A table with the kind of surface that had been scrubbed clean every morning for years. Her mother was in the kitchen and she looked at Caden Ashford standing in her small doorway with his hair wet from the rain with an expression that was carefully blank for exactly the 2 seconds it took her to process the situation, and then she looked at Alara. "This is Caden," Alara said, as if that were a sufficient introduction. "He was caught in the rain." Vera Voss nodded slowly. "I'll put water on," she said. They sat at the table, the three of them, and drank tea while the rain fell on the low roof and made its particular sound. Vera spoke little, but she was present in a way that her daughter's posture made clear was not always the case, a brightness in her eyes that Alara watched with a careful, private warmth she did not name out loud. Caden sat in the kitchen of the smallest house he had been inside in years, drinking tea from a plain cup, and he felt, with a completeness that was somewhat startling, like himself. It rained for an hour. When it stopped, he helped Alara carry the wet washing in from the line, which he did without thinking and which she accepted without comment, handing him one end of a sheet with the naturalness of someone who did not see the point in making things complicated. When he finally left, walking back toward the settlement center with Aldrich appearing from somewhere nearby with the expression of a man who has been standing in the rain for an hour and has decided to say nothing about it, Caden felt something he recognized, with some effort, as happiness. Not satisfaction. Not the specific pleasure of achieving something difficult. Just ordinary, uncomplicated happiness, the kind that comes from having spent time with someone who made the world feel more real and less performative. He had not felt it in a very long time. Aldrich fell into step beside him. "Productive morning," Aldrich said, in the tone of a man who asks questions he already knows the answer to. "Yes," said Caden. In the days that followed, he stayed in Ashvale longer than he had planned. He told himself and told Aldrich that there were good operational reasons for this. The Crane investigation was still active, communication was easier from a neutral settlement than from the heart of court, the logistics were manageable. Aldrich agreed with all of these reasons with the expression of a man who has chosen his battles carefully over 11 years, and this was not one of them. Alara came to the central ground once and met with him formally, surrounded by his staff and the Ashvale Alpha and the various officials who had business to conduct. She answered questions with precision, declined to answer others with equal precision, and navigated the whole experience with the same self-possession she brought to everything. She also came to the path at the Greywood's edge 2 more mornings, when the settlement was quiet and the light was early and gray, and they walked together and talked the way people talk when they are deciding whether they trust each other and finding out, with some surprise, that they do. He told her about the court. Not the political structure, she had declined to be impressed by political structure on the grounds that structure was only as good as the people inside it, but about what it felt like, about the particular loneliness of being in a room where everyone was paying close attention to you and no one was actually seeing you. She listened without filling the silence with reassurance, which was what most people did when he got close to something honest. She just listened, and at the end she said, "That sounds exhausting," which was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said to him about it. She told him about her mother. About the years before her father left, which she remembered in fragments and did not fully trust. The warmth she thought she remembered might have been partly constructed from hope rather than actual memory. About the years after, which were clearer and harder. About learning early that the only reliable thing was her own capability, and about the feeling that this certainty, which had kept her standing, had also made it very difficult to know what to do when someone offered her something good, because she had grown so practiced at not expecting it. He heard this and he understood it, because he had built something similar in himself over 15 years of being in a position where trust was a liability and he had to measure everything before he let it close. They were, he thought, 2 people who had learned to need very little in order to survive, which meant that neither of them quite knew what to do with plenty. On the 5th day, she came to him. Not to the central ground and not to the path. To the tent, in the morning, with a directness that made his guard step back without being asked because something in her manner communicated clearly that this was not a thing that should be impeded. She sat down across from him. She set her hands on the table, not folded together, just resting, the way they always rested. I have been thinking, she said. I know, he said. I do not want to be chosen because you are obligated to choose me. The bond, I understand what it is. I understand that it is not nothing. But I need to know that you are choosing me because you want to, not because the goddess has decided and you are simply following the instruction. He looked at her directly. I want to, he said. The bond confirmed something my wolf already knew. But my wolf knew it in the forest, before I was conscious enough to make decisions. I have spent the last several days making a decision, and it is not the bond making it. It is me. She was quiet. I also need you to know, she said, that I am not going to become someone I am not. I do not know how to be a queen. I do not know your court and I do not know your people, and there will be things I get wrong and things I refuse to do because they conflict with what I think is right. I know, he said. And you want that anyway. I want you, he said. Everything you just described is part of you. I am not interested in a version of you that has been adjusted to fit a role. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light in the tent was pale and clear, and she was looking at him with those eyes that showed you what they chose to show you, and for the first time since he had met her, she was choosing to show him something unguarded. Something open. Something that looked, he thought, like the beginning of trust. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. Yes, she said. And then, with the smallest curve of her mouth, I have made my decision. You can put it on your list. The bond settled between them quietly, in the way that the truest things happen, not with noise or drama but with a deep, resonant certainty, like something that had been waiting in the correct place finally being confirmed. He felt it and she felt it, and they looked at each other and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing necessary to say. Outside the tent, Ashvale was beginning its day. Somewhere across the settlement, Vera Voss was sitting in the kitchen with her cup of tea, and her back was straighter than it had been in years, and she was looking out the window with the expression of someone who has begun to believe that the world might still offer things she had stopped expecting. And on the shelf in a small room at the edge of the settlement, a cracked clay jar sat empty in the morning light, and it was the most important object in the story, and no one knew it except the woman who had held it in the dark and decided that some things were worth spending everything on. The retinue left Ashvale 3 days later. Ilara walked out through the central ground beside Caden Ashford, and the whole settlement watched, and Nathaniel Cross stood at the back of the crowd with his jaw tight and his eyes on the ground, and Ilara did not look at him. Not out of cruelty. Simply because he was not a part of what she was walking toward. Her mother stood at the front of the crowd, which was itself a remarkable thing, and Ilara stopped in front of her and they held each other for a long moment without speaking. I will send word when we arrive, Ilara said. And I will come back. Often. I know, Vera said. Go. She went. The court of the 7 territories was nothing like Ashvale, and Ilara had expected that, but the difference was larger and more detailed than expectation had prepared her for. The scale of it alone, the sheer physical scale, the size of the buildings, the number of people, the layers of hierarchy and protocol and tradition that governed how every hour was organized, was something that she moved through in those first weeks with the same steady practicality she brought to everything, telling herself each morning, this is a new thing. You have dealt with new things before. You will learn it. She was not wrong. She was also not prepared for how much there was to learn. Caden had given her a set of rooms that were comfortable in a way she had never experienced comfort, not opulent, not performative, but genuinely well-made, everything chosen for quality rather than display. He had also given her an advisor of her own, a woman named Philippa who had been at court for 20 years and who met Ilara in their first session with a directness that immediately made Ilara trust her. You are going to make mistakes, Philippa said, setting a cup of tea on the table with the manner of someone who operates entirely on a practical axis. Everyone does. The important thing is not to make the same mistake twice and not to let anyone see you believe you have failed when you have merely stumbled. These are different things. I know the difference, Ilara said. Philippa looked at her with reassessment in her expression. Good, she said. Then we will get along. The court itself was more complicated. There were people who were genuinely welcoming, lords and officials and advisors who were wise enough to understand that the king had made a clear decision and that positioning themselves well with the new queen was simply good politics, and who were also, some of them, capable of warmth beyond the political. There were people who were neutral, waiting to see how things settled before committing to a view. And there were people who were neither. The most significant of these was a woman named Caroline Whitmore, who was 51 years old and had been the most senior female voice at court for the last 12 years and who had, it emerged gradually and then all at once, expected for some time that when the king finally chose a mate, the choice would involve someone from within the upper ranks of court society and that she would be centrally involved in the management of that process. Ilara did not dislike Caroline Whitmore. She found her genuinely capable and smart and not, at bottom, a person of bad intentions. What Caroline was someone who had organized her expectations around a version of events that had not materialized, and who was not adjusting easily. They had dinner together 3 times in the first month, the 3 of them, Caden, Ilara, Caroline. And each time Ilara watched Caroline navigate the situation with precise social skill and the particular tension of a person who is performing ease while feeling something quite different. On the 3rd occasion, after Caden had been called away briefly to deal with something with his advisors, Caroline looked at Ilara directly across the table and said, "You are not what any of us expected." "No," Ilara agreed. "Are you going to tell me I should have expected less conventional things from the king?" "I was not going to tell you anything," Ilara said. "You are clearly not someone who needs to be told things they already know." Caroline looked at her for a long moment. "You are an unusual person," she said. "Yes," Ilara said. Something shifted in Caroline's expression, not warmth exactly, not yet, but the beginning of recalibration. Of a person deciding to update their assessment based on new information rather than defending the old one. "The trade reform proposal," Caroline said, which was a pivot so complete and decisive that Ilara nearly smiled. "The king has been trying to advance it for 2 years. There are 4 lords on the Western Council who will not budge on the grain tariff provisions. I believe there are arguments that have not been made to them yet. I have been thinking about this." "Tell me," Ilara said. And that was, effectively, the beginning of something. The Crane trial was the largest event of Ilara's first 3 months at court. Oliver Crane had been in custody since shortly after the ambush, and the process of determining everything he had organized, the depth of the network, the other officials involved, the financial structure of it, had taken weeks of careful work. When the formal proceedings began, the court was tense with the particular atmosphere of a powerful institution confronting a serious wound from within. Ilara sat through the full proceedings. Some people expected her to remain in the background on the grounds that it was not a comfortable event to witness. She stayed because she believed that looking away from difficult things was not a habit she was willing to develop. Oliver Crane was convicted on 4 counts. 2 of his associates received lesser verdicts. The process was transparent and precisely conducted, and Caden oversaw it with the steadiness that she had come to understand was not detachment but the kind of control that comes from caring deeply and choosing to express it through precision rather than emotion. Afterward, in the private room where he came to find her when the public part of the day was done, he sat across from her and was quiet for a while in the way that large things sometimes need silence afterward. She did not fill the silence with reassurance. She let it be what it was. "It was the right outcome," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "It does not feel the way I thought it would." "No," she said. "Justice usually does not. It is the right thing, and it is also always a loss, because if it had not been needed, things would have been better." He looked at her. She looked back. After a moment he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way she had touched the wolf in the forest, steadily, without pressure, just present. She turned her hand over under his and held on. Ilara found, as the months passed, that she had been right about some things and wrong about others. She had been right that there would be things she got wrong. She had been right that there would be things she refused to do. She had been wrong, she discovered, about how alone it would feel. She had expected court to be as isolating as Ashvale in its own way, a different kind of edge, a different kind of not quite belonging. Instead, she found that the edges shifted. She found Philippa, who became over time genuinely important to her. She found the head cook, an enormous calm man named August who managed the palace kitchens with absolute authority and who recognized immediately that Alara knew her way around a kitchen and who welcomed her with the respect of one practical person for another. She found 2 of the junior advisors who were young enough to be uncertain and smart enough to learn from it, and who became accustomed to finding her in unexpected places, asking the kind of questions that people are sometimes afraid to ask someone important. She found the library. The palace had a library that was the largest she had ever seen, more books than she had known existed, and she spent the first week after discovering it standing in the entrance trying to decide where to start. And then she started at one end and worked her way along, not systematically but the way she moved through the graywood, by following what was interesting and noting what she found and building a map slowly from the inside out. She found, gradually and then clearly, that she was happy. Not in the way she had imagined happiness, not the fairy tale version that had nothing to do with real life. Happy in the way that felt honest, the way that still contained difficulty and uncertainty and things that needed to be worked through, but that was also full, in a way her life had not been full before. Full of things and people and work that mattered. Vera Voss came to court in the 3rd month. Alara had sent for her carefully, with a letter she had written 3 times before settling on the right words, and she had sent a carriage that was comfortable but not overwhelming, and she had been at the gate when it arrived. Vera stepped out of the carriage and looked up at the palace and then looked at Alara, and her expression was so complicated and so present, so completely awake, that Alara felt something ease in her chest that she had not known was tight. They had 2 weeks together. Vera met Philippa and liked her immediately. She met August, who gave her a tour of the kitchen and treated her with the same respect he gave everyone who knew what they were doing. She sat in the library with Alara some evenings and they read in the same comfortable silence that they had shared in the small kitchen at the edge of Ashvale, except that now the room was large and warm and outside the windows were grounds that went on further than Ashvale's whole territory. On the last evening before Vera went home, they sat in Alara's rooms and drank tea and Vera looked around and said, "Is it what you hoped for?" Alara thought about it honestly. "It is not what I imagined," she said. "I did not imagine specifically enough. What I hoped for, I think, was to be in a place where I could be exactly who I am and have that be enough." She paused. "Yes. It is what I hoped for." Vera nodded slowly. "Your father," she said, and stopped. Alara waited. "He would have said," Vera stopped again. Then she said it, "He would have said he always knew." Alara looked at her mother. Her mother looked back. There were things between them that had been unsaid for years, not because they could not be said but because there had never quite been the right moment, and perhaps this was the moment or perhaps there would be more moments. She did not know yet. She reached across and put her hand over her mother's the way Caden had put his hand over hers on the night of the trial. "Just present. Just steady. Stay another week," she said. Vera looked at the window and the grounds in the warm room and she said, "All right." The announcement, when it came, went through the 7 territories the way any significant news travels in a large and interconnected world, fast and with complications. The Alpha King of the 7 territories had taken a fated mate, an Omega woman from a minor pack in the northern settlements, with no political lineage, no court history, no particular claim except the one the goddess had made and the one the king had made himself. Alara did not read all of it. Philippa summarized the significant responses and filtered out the ones that were simply noise, which was most of them. The ones that mattered were the ones from the leaders of the other territories, and those, one by one, arrived at the same place. The king had been clear, the choice was made, and the political cost of objecting was not worth the cost. There was one letter she read herself. It came from Ashvale, and it was not from the Pack Alpha. It was from a woman named Dorothy, who was 70 years old and had been one of the elder women, and who had known Alara since she was small. Dorothy wrote simply and directly, in a hand that was becoming unsteady with age, that she was very glad, and that she had always thought Ashvale had not known what it had, and that she hoped Alara would not forget them entirely because some of them had always been rooting for her even when it had not been easy to say so. Alara wrote back the same day. She did not hold Ashvale against the people in it who had been unkind. She also did not pretend the past had been different. She wrote to Dorothy honestly, and she said that she had not forgotten, that she did not intend to forget, and that she would come back, and she would. She sat at the desk in her rooms after she had sealed Dorothy's letter, and she looked at the small shelf where she had put the clay jar. She had brought it with her from Ashvale, in her bag among the things she had packed in the 3 hours between Caden's departure and her own. The handmaid had offered to replace it with something more appropriate for the setting, something that matched the room's quality, and Alara had said no, and she had meant it. The jar sat on the shelf among the books she was accumulating, plain and chipped at the lip. It did not look like anything important. It was the most important thing in the room. She thought about the night she had sat in the dark holding it, empty, after spending everything it had held on a stranger in the forest. She thought about how it had felt, not tragic exactly, but heavy, the weight of a decision made and resources gone and the future rearranged around the consequences. She had not regretted it then. She did not regret it now. She had the particular certainty of a person who has acted in accordance with who they are, and who knows that this kind of action does not require regret even when it costs something. She had spent her last coins on a dying wolf. She had done it because he was alive and he needed someone, and she had been there. It was that simple and that complete. Everything that had come after had come after. The coins had been the beginning of something, not in the sense that she had calculated a return on them, she never had, she never would, but in the sense that a decision made from the honest center of who you are has a way of beginning things in the world that other decisions cannot begin. She had acted from herself and the world had responded in kind. Caden came in an hour later, the way he came in most evenings when the work of the day was finished, without ceremony, shrugging off his formal jacket and hanging it over the back of the chair the way he did, which she had mentioned twice and which he still did, a habit she had decided she did not actually mind. He saw the jar in her hands and he did not say anything. He sat across from her and waited. "I was thinking about the greywood," she said. "And?" She looked at the jar. "And I think I was richer than I knew," she said. "Not the money." She paused, finding the exact right word the way she always found things, by looking at the space carefully until she could see what was in it, the certainty. "I knew what I was and what I would do and I did it. That was not nothing. That was actually everything." He was quiet for a moment. "It is everything," he said. "It is why I came to Ashvale." She set the jar back on the shelf. She looked at it there among the books, small and plain and chipped, and she thought that she was glad she had not let them replace it with something better looking. Something better looking would have been a different thing. This was the true thing. "I am going to put the letter to Dorothy out for the Morning Post," she said. "And then I need to look at the grain tariff proposal before tomorrow's meeting. Caroline thinks there is an argument that has not been made to the Western Lords yet. Is she right?" "She is," Alara said. "It took me a while to see it, but she is." She stood. She was, as always, already moving toward the next thing, because that was who she was, because she did not stop and she did not stay still and she did not wait for the world to come to her. Caden watched her move toward the desk and the letter and the work that needed doing, and he thought about the first time he had seen her across the crowd in Ashvale's central ground, walking forward with her chin level and her hands at her sides as if she were going somewhere she had decided to go. He thought about the sound of her voice in the forest in the gray light, telling him he was going to be all right. He thought she was right then, too. Alara sealed the letter and turned back to the grain tariff proposal, and the night settled quietly around the palace, and the jar sat on its shelf holding nothing and meaning everything, and somewhere in a small house at the edge of a settlement in the north, Vera Voss was sleeping properly for the first time in years, which was not a small thing, which was in fact a very large thing, which was one of the many things that had grown from a decision made in the cold grey forest by a woman with empty pockets and full certainty, and that was how it had always been, and how it would continue to be, and the story knew this even if the world did not always know it yet. Some things are worth spending everything on. Some decisions, made from the truest part of who you are, grow into things you could never have planned for. And sometimes the world, which has a habit of overlooking quiet, steady people who do what needs to be done without asking for credit, sometimes it stops, and looks, and understands at last what has been standing at the edge of the settlement all along. Ilara Voss had always known what she was worth. She had just been waiting for the world to catch up.